Değerli
Distinguished participants, distinguished online participants, we are right now at the seventh panel of today's conference. We are going to be dwelling on the theme of the COVID-19 crisis from the perspective of economists. So our speakers are Erkan Erdil from Ankara, from the Middle Eastern Technical University, Department of Economics, from the Koç University, Professor Dr. Kamil Yılmaz, the DEIC Chief Economist, Dr. Hakkı Karataş, and Professor Dr. Aykut Kibriçoğlu from the Turkish German University. Welcome. So today, we are going to be talking about now in competition with the soothsayers. So we are trying to actually share our opinions. Of course, we do not have much time as usual. We have only an hour to debate on these matters, and that's the reason why we try to be quick, and we also try to find response to your questions as well. Of course, this crisis that we are surviving right now is rather different than the endogenous risks. And of course, history, there were also certain types of crises as such, just like just like many other pandemics and epidemics. And what type of a crisis are we facing right now, sir? And we can talk about this matter with you, indeed. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to actually make some certain definitions in order to talk about how it is affecting the economists. What is a health crisis? What type of a problem did COVID-19 create? Could we please share the presentation? Yes. So, since we are economists, it's easier to actually describe the economic and financial crisis. Indeed, it depends on the past averages of financial commodities, services, and factorial changes. The prices and also the determinant threshold values can have some certain fluctuations. When we talk about the health crisis on the other side, there's a little bit of a difference in our description. First of all, and there are certain problems that is negatively impacting the health of the human being. Of course, there can be some certain lethal aspects of this, and also, on the other hand, it also creates a hardship and difficulty on the health sector itself. Of course, this can be prominent in a health crisis and also in wars sometimes, and natural catastrophes, of course. And there were two actually pandemics that we know in 1918 to 1920, which is a Spanish flu. 500 million people have been actually diagnosed with the flu, and there has been 1/3 of the population has been affected by it, and 20 to 50 million people have died. And right now, in this pandemic, between the years 2019 and 2021, there has been 253 million people who have been diagnosed. And between these two health crises, of course, there are also other crises which is not related with health crisis. And none of them have been crises that was something else rather than any type of a health crisis like the big like the financial crises. Of course, there are 5 aspects that we need to take attention to. This is quite different than the Great Depression. And since 1989, we should talk a little bit about the economic globalization and the international products, service, and production factors where mobility were mobile, and that's created actually an interdependency between countries. And on the other hand, it still is ongoing and it's not easy to reverse it. That's the reason why economies are quite integrated. And when a health crisis initiates one side, is impacting another place in the world very easily. And secondly, starting up in the year 2000, we are actually right now in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution, the AI, the big data, etc. What we are dwelling right now upon. But there are different types of factors that are really very much in interconnections. And the third factor, the World Economic Forum, is talking about, it has a report about the global risks. And these are economic, environmental, geopolitical, and community and technological risks and community risks. And generally, we can talk about these pandemics, the epidemics around the world is quite prominent. And on the other hand, as we know, as for the climate, as from the COP26, we know that there's a global warming and global climate change. We need a green innovation, but in order to create that transformation, we need to have finances, all of the finances. When we talk about these whole finances, we think about a great amount of a transformation if we also add up all the aspects that I have declared above. And also there's international migration waves started up in the beginning of 2000s. Hence the case, all of these things, we were just caught in the middle of all these things as we are also right now dealing with the health crisis. So what are the top risks? And what is a global risk? In case it is realized in the next coming decade, many countries and sectors can be negatively affected by undetermined incidents and conditions. What are the top risks? These are extreme weather, climate action failures, human environmental damages, and also the infectious diseases. And as we are talking, it's also when we talk about global crisis, we need to also think about the energy. So when we're talking about global climate change, the fourth digital transformation, and there's also a big transformation that is necessary to be made in Germany, for instance. And a research institution has made a report and has made that it says that transformation is very much necessary, but has to be done in a modest way. But in Turkey, it has to be very rigid and very immediate to be made. So there's welfare and also digital transformation, and all aspects on justice, etc., are also involved in it. How have we been caught to this pandemic? Were we prepared or not? It is a type of a crisis. It's a health crisis that occurs only every 100 years. So what to do about it? We do not have a guideline for this, as Ms. Guchin has said. So, and we were also aware of this. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that we didn't know anything about it. For instance, in the German parliament on 2012 and on 2013, a report has been made, and that report is talking about 2 or 3 scenarios. And one of them is that the Modi SARS virus, in such a situation, how are we going to be affected? And this was a risk analysis. Approximately, this report has been made 10 years ago, and people, the environment, and the society have been enrolled in this report. And the virus pandemic, as it is said that it is quite a possible risk. According to the report, it is 10 years ago, it is said that it is a possible risk. And it is such a risk that it can happen in between 100 to 1,000 years in the world's history. So we are actually aware that such a risk can be possible. It's also been reflected to the reports, but of course we didn't actually expecting it so quick. So what type of an economic crisis did it cause? Did this health crisis cause? Let me just briefly explain this to you. There are five concepts that are very much affected by each other. Just in the red box, some problems have been impacted, and that causes also the health crisis. So if the infrastructure of the health sector and the capacity is not sufficient, and if the health sector has structural problems, that can also cause an impact, an epidemic. But this crisis has been caused by COVID-19 pandemic, which causes also death and lethal problems, psychological problems, structural changes in the health sector and new health policies, and also research and development and innovation in health sector was a result of all this pandemic, and that caused also economic problems where there was actually a seizure in production, a temporary unemployment, a temporary income loss, etc. So that is the reason why many countries intended to do certain things. And maybe the most critical thing that the governments and health institutions had to do, and which was a little bit hard for them to do in the beginning of 2019 and 20, we have seen such graphs quite much. If we do not do anything, how we can see how the health sector can actually be having hardships if we just used the health sector. But if we keep the people at their homes, what will be the impact of it? But the economic crisis, it gets worse. So you need to make an actually selection of this. This caused quite a big problem for many governments, for many states. And as for the policy responses to the COVID-19 crisis in many countries of the world, very widely, economic policies have been developed. So the IMF and the OECD have created certain measures for this. Indeed, there were containment measures, fiscal measures, monetary policy measures and regulations. And on the other hand, measures have been taken in the private sector where the debt has been shared. And on the other hand, employment and social policies have to be responded as well. So, and interestingly, mobilizing research and innovation systems have become very prominent as well, which is a little bit more different than the other economic crisis. So the health crisis has important actually impacts. So of course, the policy making is quite widespread, and many countries, states had to actually try to ease the burden. And in March on 2020, maybe you have seen this caricature. So there is, people were thinking that if we can be clean, everything will be well. But on the other hand, there was also the economic crisis and recession that was upcoming. On the other hand, there's also the climate change that causes also a bad and negative impact. And finally, early on 2020 summer, this caricature has also put another wave here, which is the biodiversity collapse. This is not causality, perhaps, but these are actually impacting each other. This crisis, different than the other ones, is because that there is also 5 or 4 different aspects that we need to think about. They all have come at the same time. That's the reason why it's hard to fight against it. And maybe in the next years, we can actually take it in a broader talk later on. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Dr. Hakkı Karataş for an Economic Relations Board Chief Economist. because during the time the pandemic has become obvious to each and every one of us. One of the most important impact is that there was an actually lack of impact on chains of the supply and demand, and that's the reason why there has been a great amount of a demand on the industries. Hence the case. And post-crisis, I suppose, when we make the evaluation, this is an area where we are going to discuss a lot. So, Mr. Hakke, the Turkish economy, the foreign economy, as for sectoral distribution, as for DEIC, and also as for your own approach, how did this process started? How is it developed? Where we are? Where are we?
Thank you very much. Actually, Aykut has already summarized these parts, and I'm not going to make the same repetitions. As Foreign Economic Relations Board, we have the mission to represent Turkey in abroad. We are the key to open abroad as Foreign Economic Relations Board for Turkey, and I'll be mentioning these parts. If you allow me, I'll start with a joke of the Nasrettin Hoca, which is a very pioneer name in Turkish folk. And they asked, it's very similar to COVID-19. So at the end, what we can understand from that joke, which can't be translated, we can understand that it is something that as people, we have retreated our houses, and producers, employers, everyone retreated to their houses, and majority of the economic dimension stopped. So it started in China, and so the supply chain of China was distorted seriously. As Foreign Economic Relations Board, we said it, and it still is available on our website. Our main motto was not to suspend our business. This was our motto. So when it comes to Turkish health side, of course, we took certain precautions. Some of the lockdowns happened and production was stopped up to a certain point. But on the supply chain, we did not want to provide any problems. We did not want to create any problems at all. As the industrialists, as the business world, this was our approach, and we can actually collect the fruits of it. And COVID-19 is a big risk, of course, but each and every risk has brought certain benefits. Especially COVID-19 has also yielded certain benefits for Turkey. It has started in China, and China is the biggest supplier for Europe and the United States. When a product is produced by the Europeans and the Americans, majority of the raw material is either procured in China or else produced in China. China is a very big country in terms of scale economy, and all of a sudden disruption happens in the supply chain of China, and that disruptions and distortions put everyone into a very challenging situations in Europe and the United States. But as Foreign Relations Economic Board of Turkey, we said that we did not want to create any halt in the supply chain, in the economic production. We did our best, and there is a big order towards Turkish products from the United States and Europe. So in that respect, COVID-19 is of course a big risk. It has yielded very negative problems, consequences, and on the economic side, we've had very negative situations as well. But at this point where the vaccination has reached a certain point, and with the precautions we have already taken, we have not stopped industrial production. Right now we have the biggest capacity to receive orders from Europe, and actually we can see it on the numbers. So foreign trade numbers have been announced by Turkish Exporters Union. So each and every number we can see that we are in big records, and currently $212 billion has been passed. And this is the exportation volume we have. And compared to 2021, it was 8.9, but this year we're expecting 10% of growth. When we look at this growth on the export side and on the growth side, production and manufacturing sector have big roles. Based on the numbers, we can understand that. And 90%, 94% of the exportation is based on manufacturing sector. So it means that during the pandemic, when the precautions were taken, when the lockdown precautions were taken as Foreign Relations Board, we always continued our productions and supply chain. was under the control. It was our statement, and politicians, of course, paid attention to these important factors when they took their decisions. As Foreign Economic Relations Board, we can say this very clearly. In terms of European countries and the United States of America, Turkey has become a great country for supply chain, of course, service sector. Other sectors will also follow manufacturing sector. Right now, the service trade will we know that service sector will also increase, but manufacturing sector is on the recovery period. If you allow me, I'll try to wrap it up here. This is not a single stop opportunity. Can it be made a sustainable opportunity for us? So in the very beginning, it happened in China after COVID-19 stops in 2020 to 2023, hopefully. Can China replace us? Or else can we really use this opportunity in a sustainable manner, or else we just use this once and then will we be going back to old system? In order to answer this, we can say that actually it's in our hands, it's up to us. I'd like to give you certain conditions. First and foremost, both European Union countries and the United States shifted their orders to Turkey. And these countries are rich countries and their scales are bigger than us. So their order scales could be higher. So they don't want this 10 billion product. When they order something at the value of $10 billion, we can't say, we don't have that capacity. So in that respect, we have to also scale up. If you want to be a competitor to a country like China, we have to scale up. We can have investments, companies make their investments, or else in the furniture sector, we've seen that 6 to 7 furniture sectors, they came together, these representatives, and they merged their powers and they scaled up. Of course, cooperation is very important, and we could do the same thing. We can have the scale up to answer the orders from the USA and EU countries. I'd like to ask a question in relation to that. During the pandemic, Turkish industry was selected by other countries, like you mentioned. The important thing is to make it sustainable and to nourish other sectors. But when we have a look at the exportation per kilogram, it's like less than $1. So for exporters, for industrialists, maybe you can also include other sectors, but towards increasing the added value in exportation, especially in recent times, Green Deal, and also with respect to decrease of carbon footprint, are there any impressions of preparations for this kind of agreements in sectors? What are the possible steps that we can take? Can you please interpret on them? Thank you very much. You have underlined great points, and you have maybe oriented my speech towards a very great point. I'd like to say these words. By the way, I've given you these conditions. The first one was the scale. We have to scale up. And the second one, in this kind of developed markets, for instance, the EU markets, or else the United States of America, if you want to work with some rich countries, first and foremost, you have to have a good quality. You can't make it sustainable with cheap labor. So while we increase our production capacity, we have to also pay attention to productivity and added value. You have intervened in a great time, because I was just going to mention that. And we are also talking about the importance of supply chain. Yes, as Turkey, we have already passed the exam on the supply chain. We have not made very severe damages, but there comes a global value chain as well. So what is this value chain? For instance, an iPhone is sold to a consumer at $1,000, but its different parts are produced in different places, like R&D is made in another country or design is made in another country. There are different processes providing a product in all. So what country is providing the highest added value? Of course, the owner of the iPhone is the United States of America. That's why United States of America gets the highest added value out of their product. So in a global chain value, we have to be focusing ourselves on the highest level of value. So we have to be climbing up on the higher places again in this global value chain. We have taken steps in this respect. Our final target is to increase exportation, as you mentioned, unit per kg. We don't want to be at low prices because otherwise it's not going to be sustainable. So to the best that we can do, we should be providing high-tech products with higher added values. So we have taken steps in that respect. Let me give you two examples. There are free industrial zones, for instance. Those free zones has been applied, by the way, have been implemented as of 1980s, and two specialty free zone has been opened. What does that mean? The first one is related to software and IT sector, by the way. Maybe in the upcoming periods, we will see more and more. And this is what is done in those free zones. Added value products, high added value. This is the critical point which differentiates these regions from other zones. It should be on a certain specialty area, and it should have higher added value levels for exportation so that the state will have more incentives to the companies. Yes. Thank you very much. Well, now, after the outbreak of the pandemic, all of a sudden, many changes happened. Even though it seemed like that, Erkan Hocam, I'd like to give you the floor and ask you a question. If we remember the end of 2019, on one side there was Trump administration, and he was walking, maybe running for his second presidential period, because there was the conflict of trade between the USA and China, and at that conflict, the United States convinced China for the agreement in his own conditions, and they were going to be signing the agreements on the upcoming January 17, and there was also the Brexit pain at the end of 2019. That pain was eliminated. So globally speaking, it was a very rosy world that we were thinking. That was the atmosphere at least, but in 2019, again on the other side, I can tell you for the economists, many economists felt that there was a big crisis coming on. They felt that impression. Even just a sparkle could ignite everything, could burn everything. Let alone sparkle, actually, it was all on fire. And pandemic divided every place into different sides, like the income generation, income distribution, and science policies. Everything was separated, divided into different parts. So was this crisis a surprise in its aspect, or else, was the world economy going towards a crisis already? And in terms of science policies and growth policies, when you evaluate this crisis, what is the picture that we have right now, pre-COVID and post-COVID? How can you interpret the world in these two aspects?
As a revolutionary economist, I have to say that this is not a problem that can be available only for this epoch, but it has been coming since the past, since the history. And that is why in the beginning of 2020, the global pandemic that started in the end of 2019 indeed has been impacted us. In the 80s and in the 90s, there has been a historical process that we had to follow. But on 2008, there has been a financial recession, of course, when the global capitalism couldn't overcome that financial recession. And right now, there is another shock that has popped up. Now, the pandemic is actually speeding up this process. We cannot go back to the years before 2008. And I think that we cannot return to the previous years. The normalization that has been initiated on 2010 was only temporary in the financial sector. There has been an actually improvement, but onto global capitalism, the real sector problem couldn't be solved. And we know that in Turkey, these issues have been deeply actually debated, and also that has been discussed for years by different authors, and to be rebuilt. And there are two aspects that we need to be talking about. And the American central bank and the Chinese central bank had have taken pragmatic interventions, and on the other hand, big companies receive certain resources, and they have given those sources to certain companies that were already very prominent. And on the financial distribution has created also an abundance as well. IMF, on the other hand, has helped that process and taken a look to the data. The banking system had certain, of course, failures, and that has been transferred to the customers of the banks. But of course, between the companies and also in the households, there has been inequality. In addition to this, all the inequality within the community has risen up. In the developing countries, of course, you can feel that aspect quite strongly. The reason why there was the debt increase in certain companies and also in the households, and all the interventions seem likely as if it created a stability in the economic process. However, there has been a capitalist inequality which deafened the situation. In the EU policy documents, we have seen also in other institutions report, we have seen new employment areas couldn't be created. And of course, within the countries and between countries, these financial situations created also a disruption. Of course, there was a free movement of the products, but effort and labor wasn't going so speed fast as it was in the products. So the migration is also involved in this. Immigration has increased in time. Of course, there are historical backgrounds for this matter. And where we are right now, because of negative impacts of globalization, is impacting negatively still many countries, and has become also an actually barrier between economic development for the certain states. And in many developing countries and developed countries, with the pandemic on the other side, couldn't actually deal with pandemic. And the reason why we couldn't achieve anything better in this process is because of this wild capitalism. And there has been a giant capital debt in the companies, which we have seen, both in the United States central banks and other countries' central banks have caused this this situation. Actually, the same policies have been actually implemented again without quite desperately, actually. And even though interventions have been taken, that couldn't actually create a well-being in the states. And that is quite obvious that with these types of interventions cannot actually help the states at all, particularly independent countries. There is a rise of prices in food, and we also feel it very prominently in our country. This is a general problem right now. And on the other hand, the direct investments are also decreasing, and this global capitalist system post pandemic will create even worse results. Not only monetary policies can come over the matters, particularly the developed countries have already realized it with the financial policies. They need to actually think about the new financial policies on 2020, 2021. Manufacturing had to rise, and in order to create an equality, and in order to create an equal employment is necessary for the time being. And hence the case, the monetary policies have to abide by these new rules. And on there is no data set yet that is occurred in order to create that equality. So there are studies that are ongoing, however, which is quite promising. And the income distribution, the equal income distribution has to be made. The European Union has a data set which has been made for 2019 for the 2020's first quarter. The member states have taken interventions on the financial issues, but it has we see that all the monetary help has actually created a positive impact on the households' financial incomes. And then it is also said that the impacts of the pandemic is similar to the 2008 and 2019 crisis, and that financial crisis impact has not yet been overcome. And on the other hand, there, particularly when the unemployment, particularly in the laborers and also in young graduates, there is a great amount of a depression here over these group of people. And in the United States, Ethan has made a study, and according to that study, it has given a little bit of a different result. On 2019 and 2020, estimates have been actually taken up, and it is seen that due to the pandemic, he says that he is against that the pandemic caused inequality in inequality in incomes. However, it is also seen that the rich had a little effect due to that pandemic, he said. Taking a look to the matter on a deepened way, proportional to the population and in between countries, there is an absolute income difference. The difference is increasing, on the contrary. And we have also made some certain studies, for instance, in tourism, which is very much important for Turkey as a sector. All the losses for 2020 was at 60%. And in particular, in the last period of time in Turkey, together with the pandemic, the health tourism, there has been a 39% of a loss of income. And indeed, these service sectors in Turkey, because Turkey is a very strong manufacturing country, that is also something that I defend. But right now, it is actually not using it very much. But certain levels of certain aspects, we have been quite disrupted. And how to overcome them, how to manage it, I can say that there are four aspects that we need to be talking about, which are problematic: climate change and the greenhouse emissions. Secondly, sustainable and transparent food manufacturing. 3, and public health. And 4th, economic welfare. And of course, these are supranational, international issues. But on a national level and on local levels, what do we have to do in order to ease the matter? As for climate crisis, on a national level, renewable energy sources have to be accessed immediately, as you know, and particularly with the discussions that we have made and with the European Union. One area that we are discussing is agriculture and environment, and we need to have resources for that. Unfortunately, we do not have those resources, but we have to create those resources. Green construction is also very much important. We need to think about green construction projects. Sustainable smart cities is necessary. And in order to decrease the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, we need to give priority to companies that are dealing with it. And on the other hand, household energy has to be delivered as well, and some certain supports have to be given, and green vehicles have to be disseminated, and there should be also created an awareness of the environment within the public opinion. As for food, a sustainable agricultural development has to be reviewed, whereas the ecosystem, the food ecosystem has to be also determined. And the national monetary incentives have to be found out, and local agricultural networks have to be created. These are some certain political tools that is necessary. As for health, on the other hand, on a national level again, public health, which is supervised, has to be reviewed, and we need to rebuild it. The health technologies and also pharma development is also necessary. That's the reason why we need to have research and development and technological systems to be prepared for this. And we also have seen that in another meeting, we have also discussed about the matter of health, particularly on public health. On a global level and on national level, the intellectual property rights have to be reviewed once again. And as for the economic welfare, we need to give support to certain households for a better income. And also we need to bring new training. We need to create education for the youngsters, and we need to give new trainings for new areas of development, and financials together with financial supports. And we need to also give support to the SMEs as well, particularly the potential SMEs definitely need such a support from the state. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the next speaker. And if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. There's a question for you. Ahmet Coşkun Yıldırım has asked this question. Pandemic, climate change, and sustainability. Now, apart from economic development, there is actually a sovereign way of economic development, like a quality. Is it possible to have a quality, not growth, but becoming smaller in an economic point of view? Yes, for the community, for the equality in the community, equality, getting smaller inequality, or downsizing is possible, of course, is necessary, and this pandemic has showed this to us. We were always talking about growth, but again, when we talk about the development issue, we need to take it back to our agenda, because without a good quality development, we cannot talk about a good economy indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Kami. In this period of time, 2020 March, there has been a chaos indeed. And first and foremost, the states have created an economic procedure. There has been a monetary growth coming from the central banks, and each country does have different policies about it. Would you please talk a little bit about the economic policies about the states, and you can give some successful examples, good practices perhaps as well. And you can also make an evaluation based on Turkey. And we have two questions as well. And I would like to ask those questions in the end of your speech. Thank you.
Hocam, rica etsem ekranı tam göremiyoruz o Ben tabii ki bu pandemi özetle.
Well, yes, of course. If I am to summarize this pandemic, it's a shock of 100 years, maybe. It's a shock that can be possible once in a century. And it caught all the governments with a big surprise and unexpectedly. So in this kind of shocks, in this kind of pandemics, the resilience and the power of the institutions and the organization between institutions and the states have been revealed. So historically speaking, in the very beginning, there was a shock of demand and also the shock of supply, right? Because we were in our houses and they couldn't demand anything, but we couldn't supply anything. We couldn't produce anything. For the last couple of months, it was like that. But on the consumption and the production, all the expenses were also affected. But along with the summer months, we could see that production was able to continue, especially on the manufacturing industry, where the distance could be kept. And the production was initiated. Then shock was understood that it was something asymmetrical to sectors, and some sectors were affected directly, like service sector. A lot of service sectors were affected, but some service sectors were affected positively, like logistics, transportation, and home delivery sectors were affected positively. And production industry was affected positively because people were shopping, online shopping, even though they were locked in our houses. And also we were able to see the changes on our sectors. And your political reaction to asymmetrical shock should be on the parallel to this shock. So if you take it into consideration, it must be again reflected on the households. Everything could be recorded, registered electronically, and we can understand who lost what in these conditions. It's very easy. Who lost what percentages of their incomes or business volumes. It's easy to compensate that. Some countries provide direct income support, of course. Which countries? Developed countries, and the ones who had settled institutions, who have a high social state perception, actively working in the last 80 years. But countries like us, developing countries, these kind of support and incentives were just based on the decree and also selections of the government, because there is this state which can't be organized effectively. I'll be giving you some examples specific to Turkey, but like you have stated beforehand, Sinan, central governments against this kind of big shocks enlarged their balance sheets. And 2008 shock was a big systemic shock for capitalism. For them to get over it, for them to cope against its long-term stagnancy potential, was to, as of 2000s, maybe as of 2080s, approximately it was $4.5 trillion of 3 to 4 central banks increased by 3.5 times till 2019. It was $15 trillion. It increased the wealth, richness, and it led to capital entry to capital boards and care trades that we know from the United States, China, European countries, were turned into financial investments in our countries. Again, we saw certain effects. We got benefit of these effects. And on the pandemic period, it happened even further. We are right now talking about $26.5 billion dollars of balance sheet growth. Fed and also European Union Central Bank and Japan Central Bank. So as of this moment, or else maybe in the upcoming period, maybe, yes, maybe because this enlargement on the markets, crisis were not felt in its highest maximum level, but this pandemic is such a huge shock that even the starting and the ending of it is very challenging, and the Fed is now having some difficulties. So I'm just skipping because of the time. When I talk about inflation transition, Fed is again in a very difficult situation. Is it really transition of inflation or not? So as I've stated before, and this is a symmetrical shock, and the shock in the manufacturing sector was felt very heavily, and China recovered itself from this situation more rapidly than other countries, even though it had this crisis firstly. Then it led to certain changes on the manufacturing sector, and commodity prices increased by 200% in some items. In some invaluable or non-valuable metals, there is a very severe increase, as previous speakers have mentioned. There were big problems on the supply chain, for instance, turbines with China, due dates with China changed. That's why there was a shift towards other countries like us. And for us, the exportation increases, and companies focusing on exportation boomed their profits, and they are also carrying the Istanbul Stock Exchange on their shoulders. But this is what we see. Increase on the commodity prices led to price increase on the consumer side. We see this in the United States and on the Chinese market as well. When these are reflected over the consumption, both in developing countries and developed countries, inflation will rise. So what happens then? What should we wait for 2022? For instance, Fed, based on its projections, each and every resource, $120 billion of resource is given to the market. So with $15 billion of decrease on liquidity, it's going to be taken down to zero till June. Then there's going to be interest increase. But this is what we see because of the inflation outperforming others. Fed might change its projection. And as a result of that, next year, in the economies, there's going to be a big inflation risk. And against this inflation, if we just use the gun, use inflation as a weapon, maybe there's going to be slowing down. There's this very big shock. There's this very fast and speedy entry to the crisis, then the ending of the crisis, then this oscillation of all these markets. Let's come to Turkey. If you just have a look at the markets, I think it's a very pessimistic. In 2022, to me, I think, I believe we've given a wrong response to this asymmetrical shock. I think you need to give asymmetrical income support. But if I don't lose, I mean, you don't need to give me credit support. But I mean, if you just provide credit support, loan support, I can get it. The ones that must have been distributed to the real people who were in loss did not receive the support that they needed. And there was a credit enlargement, and TL devaluated, and then central bank just changed its perception. After that, the head of the governor of central bank changed, and the minister changed, but all these changes led us to this situation. We have taken out of pandemic and we are growing. We will be one of the fastest growing countries, but we are having the inflation in its maximum level as well. And as of this moment, while I'm on my way, I've heard about 25% increase on sugar prices, and it's just the beginning. Next year, that we will see much more price increases. This was the opinions of the people working on the field. This is very simple, actually. When you look at Turkish lira value, inflation is also rising very enormously, and central government bank ignores what other banks do. They just choose the reverse direction and they just decrease the interest. This is what they are focusing on. We are expecting again a decrease on the interest, and there is again a very free fall for Turkish lira. And in the upcoming year, next year, it's going to be even harsher. We might have elections or some other things, but it's not going to be easy for Turkish economy. And the effects of asymmetrical shock will be felt by the citizens in an asymmetrical way again, because the ones who are wealthier will not lose too much if they are also having some foreign exchange investments. They might not lose, but the ones who have some fixed constant income, for them to lose more and more is something which is indispensable. Maybe I can ask you questions. Can Çeliksöz has two questions for you. One is already you have mentioned, but maybe you like to touch upon this. In the United States and in European countries, as a result of the policies applied by the central banks, is this increasing inflation, is this increase on inflation going to be temporary? And my second question is that in the exit of this pandemic process, in the ending of the pandemic, we know that there is a very high increase on the prices of the commodities and the consumer market. What are the precautions that the developing countries should take against these changes? And there is a general question here. Muzaffer Shakar is asking to everyone, with the interest decrease, is it possible to change this economic situation? By the way, we have already completed our time. Maybe we can have just 2 to 3 minutes to answer the questions. Okay, I'll start with the last question. With this, unfortunately, with this interest discount, it's not possible for us to recover from this situation, and we are actually walking towards a perfect storm. In the United States, and as of the last quarter of 2019 till this period of 2021, total wealth increase was $20 trillion. This is what I read from Professor Alp's articles on Twitter. It's a great increase because there's increase on the real estate prices, and also stock exchange prices have increased enormously, and there's this effect of wealth, and it leads to higher consumptions. And to control this, you have to make this interest better. It's not easy to say this inflation will be permanent, because central banks have experience against this inflation, but this inflation will be with us. It's not going to go down. It's not for Turkey. I mean, a couple of years it will just sustain around us. And when it comes to commodity prices increase, I've mentioned that there is this supply boom, a demand boom on the manufacturing sector. It has reflected in the metal sector, steel sectors. That's why, unless these go back to normal, the prices of the commodities will not go back to normal levels. But when there's the interest increase, I believe it's going to become much more normalized. I have two questions. If you allow me, I'll read it very fast. Özlem Kaya, further than providing the stability on the price, maybe the current deficit could be closed. So in that way, exportation could be increased, importation could be limited. With the local production, there's going to be lowering on the prices, and inflation will be down. As a result of devaluation on Turkish lira, there's going to be much more income inequality, what do you think? Cenk Uçar asks, there is this problems on the crisis. What are the effects of this commodity increase on the raw materials? We have already seen increase on the expenses. We are having all these effects of the global inflation. Many governments have already provided cash support according to FAT report. There is increase on the household dividends, but in the upcoming period, will it be permanent? The demand, will it be permanent? These rising inflation, individually speaking, what kind of precautions can we take? I mean, they have written everything on their minds, but I'd like to thank them. They are great questions. Kamil Hocam already answered these questions related to its inflation part. I agree with you. There's a stagflation concept. I think it's unnecessary. I mean, it's not timely because in 1740 stagflation, when we have a look at this 73, when there was this attack to Libya, raw crude oil production was started and crude oil price increased up to 5s. And also this process was not the same for today's process as of the beginning of the pandemic. Kamil has mentioned that it's been an enormous expansion. About this expansionist movements, unfortunately, does not reflect on the production. Maybe this productivity could not be felt on the production, but when we go back to normal, I don't think there's stagflation on the inflation. A couple of years from now on, I believe there's going to be dissolved. These problem is going to be dissolved. For economists, maybe we have this sampling. Inflation is not a pure monetary phenomenon. So in the short term, mid-term and the long term, if you think inflation is permanent, if you want to decrease inflation permanently in the mid and long term, it should be maybe evaluated differently. And this is an approach which is the reducing the current deficit. And it might also decrease the need for dollars. If there is reduction on the current deficit, reserves could be increased. This is an approach also triggered by this central bank. I think central banks should just give up on this approach, because the better they leave this approach, the sooner we will be recovering from our losses. Because fictionally, maybe, I think phenomenally, maybe there is this wrongful act and we have to just go back from this approach. And the thing which is going to decrease the current deficit, in the very beginning, we've discussed that kilogram price on exportation must be increased. It can only be possible with added value products. On the importation, there is more than 60% raw material dependency and intermediary material dependency. We have to go back to local production, local product use, and it requires long-term industrial and technology policies. It's not for 3 months, 5 months, or 1 year, 2 years policies. We need longer-term policies. ICUT is already working on these topics. This is how I think, and we have already extended our time, but I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'd like to give them their last round. They're asking, Marx, what is your last word? Last word is normally for the ones who can't speak at all, but our speakers have already touched upon great points, and I'd like to thank them for their contribution, and would like to thank our audience and the ones who have asked their questions. Thank you very much for your participation. We also would like to thank the Turkish Capital Markets Boards Union. In the 5th Congress, under the eye of the Economists, we have discussed COVID-19 crisis.